into it. I want to talk about something in the first session that I didn't quite get the time to do, but I want to very quickly, because it's related to some of the stuff Susan talked about, is to bring about 3 insights that are in the practice of spiritual direction that have an impact on integrating the spiritual. This is something Amy is a trained spiritual director. Sister Mary Jane is a trained spiritual director. I'm a trained spiritual director. There are 3 things that are kind of, in my training, that are fundamental to doing spiritual direction and helping open people up spiritually. The first is always looking at obstacles and facilitating conditions. One of the things that always gets in the way of transformation are just any kind of obstacle. The obstacle spiritually can be beliefs. They have a belief that gets in the way. It can be guilt. Guilt either that they feel guilty because of something they've done themselves, or guilt they feel from their religious participation. An obstacle can actually be being involved in a cult or being involved too much in a kind of unhealthy church, but an obstacle can also be creating your own, somebody who's creating their own spirituality and seeing themselves as the only adequate judge of spirituality and validity. When I do spiritual direction, I'm often attuning to obstacles and conditions. What's getting in the way of spiritual openness? What can actually facilitate? A lot of what Susan was doing was talking about, in essence, obstacle and facilitating condition work. In a lot of the dialogues, even the dialogue here, the obstacle is, I've never really shared this before. I don't know that I've ever shared that I've had a spiritual experience. I don't even know that I've actually put a lot of validity into this spiritual experience. One thing you can do with the kind of person that I was portraying is not just looking at what was your experience, but does it make a difference that you were on a retreat? Does it make a difference that you were part of a community? How are they related to it, or how are they not related to it? Is there something that's important about the fact that you were part of this retreat, but also went off and spent time alone? And so you're looking at the obstacles, what may be getting in the way of being open spiritually. But then what she was really doing was plumbing the depths of it and looking for what are the conditions that open someone spiritually. And it doesn't have to have God talk. What she was doing by talking about the physical elements of the experience, hands on the shoulder and all of that, it can move into, well, what would help you nurture that thing in the future? What would help you nurture that kind of experience down the road? Susan, I'll go ahead and take those now. The microphone's going out.
Can't have that.
Thank you. Susan, I think these are dead.
Now they came out of the new box.
They really?
They really did.
Maybe I put them in.
Maybe put them in backwards.
That would be.
That's my trick.
That would be, as my wife would say, stop looking for where others are at fault. Look at where you are. Yes. As a matter of fact, they're fully charged and perfect. A second thing which Susan talked about, focus on experiences of God over beliefs, practices, and shoulds. Shoulds are a huge part of creating spiritual blockages, because often people go, well, I shouldn't feel guilty. Why not? I should be doing this. Why? I should have responded this way. Well, how did you know? How would you have known? Now you know what you should, maybe what you could have done, but how would you have known ahead of time? As she said, don't get focused in theological debates or even debates over practices, religious practices or the rest. Stay with the experiences. That's what you're mining. That is, in Freud's language, that would be the royal road, is stay with experiences. Finally, in spiritual direction, focus on the primary sense of God and discernment. What is God saying to you through this? This is exactly what Susan talked about, where the primary thing was, what's your sense of God's Where is God in this? Have you experienced God in this? Have you ever had this experience? But it's also always connected to, this is what Susan did really well. If those were God's hands, what were God's hands saying to you? So what she was doing, she was connecting the discernment to something physiological, but also spiritual. And that's also something spiritual directors are always looking at. So what I want to do right now is I want to talk about what is the relationship between spirituality, theology, religion, and all of that. Because I will tell you right now, there is a trend in our culture to walk away from religion and to see religion as bad. Problem with that, even people who have created their own spirituality, they are adopting a theology and a religion. It's there whether they want it to be or not. Now, it may not be Catholic, it may not be Presbyterian, it may be Bobism or Lindaism, but they're developing their own belief system and they're developing their own theology. By going into this idea that somehow spirituality can be not connected to religion and theology is being naive. Because what we're talking about is at the level of human being. Give you an example. Anybody here follow sports at all? What sports do you follow, Bob?
Steelers.
Stillers. Okay, the Stillers. Do you have opinions about the Stillers and kind of what they need to be doing?
Yeah.
So you have a belief system.
Yes, sir.
And you have a religious practice around the Steelers. What is it? Oh, come on, this isn't even hard. You watch the games.
Yeah, the God's on our side.
Yeah, well, it's not even that. That's a belief system. But your practice is you watch games, you go to games, you wear black and gold on Sundays. Those are that's religious-like practices.
Yes.
We may think spirituality can be disconnected, but you're always going to have beliefs, you're always going to have practices, because that's the nature of humans. You all have the same thing here as counselors. You have been trained in beliefs. You know, I mean, you can see it differently in terms of, well, there's the Holy Temple and belief system of Gestalt.
I also remember the Immaculate Reception.
Yeah, there you go. I was one of the ones who sort of watched it. I will tell you about the Immaculate Reception. I was 13 years old in Philadelphia, so I did see it on TV. And when it went off their hands and I thought it was going down, I swore and stormed out of the room. And everybody in the room started cheering, saying, "Graham, you got to come back." And I thought they were screwing with me. And I was like, "Stop screwing with my emotions." They're like, "No, Franco Harris caught it." So I went back and I saw replays. So I never saw it live, but I did see the replay. But whatever we are, whether it's EMDR, whether it's Gestalt, cognitive behavioral, narrative therapy, ACT, whatever these are all based on almost religious-like belief systems, theological systems, and there are practices that go with it. It's important to understand that because if you do, you then know how to use them. If you don't, then what happens is you perpetuate problems that persist. So let me talk about what is the relationship between theology, religion, and spirituality. I think of it as being like a body. Theology is the bones. It's the basic structural understanding system of which everything is built on. You develop kind of a theology which then allows you to intentionally build practices, liturgies, whatever. This is true when you think about counseling. Before there is EMDR, there is somebody who stumbled across something and then basically said, "Oh, I think there's a theory underlying this." They develop the theory and then they begin to develop practices around it. Same thing with Gestalt. Adler, right? Adler? Fritz Perls, okay. You know, basically what happens is he starts gaining an insight. He begins to develop a kind of structural cognitive system. And he then begins to develop practices, insights around it. And then others join him and they begin to develop bodies of knowledge. Belief systems are neither good nor bad. They just are, and they're essential to us. We all have belief systems about everything. It's like the bones of something. Religion is like the body. It's like the muscles, the sinews, the pumping blood. It's how whatever beliefs we have are physically manifested. As we talked about the religion of the Stillers, our Stillers, as we talk about, there's a belief system about the Steelers, which is they should win the Super Bowl every year. And if they don't, it's a failure. But there are also practices. You do things with your body. You dress the right way. You get your TV set the right way. Or if you go to the game, there's particular places you park. There's places you blah, 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 blah. Things you buy, etc. Spirituality is the breath. Spirituality is, at least if you take it biblically, in the very first chapter, three chapters, spirituality, ruach and nefesh, are Hebrew words that talk about life. That there's life that comes through into the body. In Genesis 2, God grabs all this little dirt, creates little hairs and fingers, and then breathes nefesh into it, breathes life into it, but also breathes spirit into it. Here's the problem, is we have a tendency to want to cut these things off. We want to create a spirituality without a theology, without a body. And when we try to do these things, what happens is we actually weaken the spirituality. For example, let's say we get a theology. Let's say we have a very strong theology and a very strong spirituality. This is what I experienced in seminary. A lot of professors who are really smart theologically, and they have their own spirituality, they may or may not really care that much about church. I mean, quite frankly, weird thing about going to seminary in the Protestant seminaries, you didn't get taught a whole lot about how to do church. You get taught about Bible, you get taught about theology, you get taught about pastoral care. You don't really get taught about how do you run a church, how do you operate in the church, which we're seeing the effects of that now. So let's say you have breath and bones, but no body. What do you have?
An undead skeleton.
Yeah, skeleton with wind blowing through it. I mean, this is what happens when you have a really strong belief system, a really strong, kind of spirituality, but there's no practice related to it. It's all in your head. It just doesn't do anything. It's just there in your head. It's in your imagination. Another is what happens when we have really strong spiritual practices and breath but no theology. What happens when you have breath and a body but no bones? What do you have?
Something like
It's the blob. Bob, what is the blob?
Steve McQueen.
Yeah. There's a lot of people here who don't know what it was. It was a movie starring Steve McQueen.
Well, it was a big putty
Blob.
blob.
And it would eat you. And the amazing thing was, it was really slow moving, and people would stand in front of it going, ah, ah, and it would take 5 minutes for the thing to consume them. But anyway, the blob came out of the Arctic or something like that. Anyway, or came from outer space. You see this in a lot of the New Age stuff, where they have tried to get rid of a belief system, but they have practices. I mean, it could be Gwyneth Paltrow, goopy stuff. It can be, crystals. And I'm not denigrating them. What I am saying is, for a lot of these things, you end up with a lot of practices without an understanding of what the practice is for or how it relates spiritually. This is not saying, therefore, you should become any particular religion. It's just a recognition that these things have a relationship with each other. Now, I will tell you, one of the problems that I see in our culture, and I'm saying this as a Presbyterian pastor, is what happens when you have bones in a body but no breath?
Dead.
You have death. This is what people are saying about the church, that it's dying or dead. I agree with them. I mean, you can see it. My denomination, when I went to seminary in 1983, there were 4 million Presbyterians. We now have 1 million. Had basically almost it's about a 70% decline. The key thing in recognizing this is, if you try to do therapy where you're just dealing with the spirituality but not dealing with some level of belief system and some level of body system, you're actually not dealing with the spiritual. You cannot just cut them off from each other. What you can do is explore the relationships between all of them. To what extent does your religious practices, is this nurturing a belief system and a spirituality, or are the practices actually deforming you? Are they transforming you, or are they deforming you? If you're engaging in practices that aren't working, that can be deforming. And so the question can be, should you stay in that practice? Or is there another way of being involved in it? I'm going to talk more in depth about this in a little bit. Theologically, if you have a belief system, the belief system can be personal or it can be collective. God hates me because of my sexual orientation. That's a belief system. But it can also kind of revolve around, it can also be my church says that I'm terrible and sinful because of my orientation. That's a more collective theological perspective. The question you can do is, and this is exactly what Susan was doing, which is explore the beliefs, explore the practices. Are they transforming or are they deforming? Are they? And it doesn't mean you have to say, I think you need to leave your church. I think you need to become a Buddhist. That's not where we are. But exploring with them, where are the beliefs something that are nurturing your life, or are they creating struggles? Are the practices nurturing your life, or are they creating struggles? Or, a lot of times you can get people who have a strong belief system and strong practice, but they don't even know what to do with the spiritual, because what they've done is they've substituted belief and practice for God. I find that in my work, working with pastors, that's really a large part of what I find is they have very strong belief systems about theological systems. They have very strong opinions about where the church is. But if I ask them, well, where in the church right now do you experience God? We'll be like, well, I don't really think about that. Or I'll work with pastors and say, where in the worship service do people experience God? Well, I don't know. We're just, well, why are you doing all the practices you've been doing? Well, it's because we've always done. And so a large part of what I'll do, I remember one pastor I worked with, this is like 25 years ago, 30 years ago, 25 years ago, who said, every Sunday I get people coming up to me saying, wow, your sermon really helped me. Your sermon was really great. And he goes, I'm not even sure I believe in God anymore, but I'm their pastor. And this is something where, they're connecting with spiritual so they can hear something of God even in what he's saying. But he's not doing it at all. And part of the job we were working on is how do you reconnect with a sense of God that then flows through your beliefs, flows through your practices, even in ways that may transform how you are as a leader or how you are as a person. Does that all make sense? Key thing I want you to be aware of, it's easy to get sucked into religion and spirituality are enemies of each other. Or religion or spirituality and theology are enemies of each other. They're not. Deforming practices and religions are enemies to spirituality. Deforming beliefs are enemies. But in itself, we are people who have beliefs. We are people who have practices. We are people who have spirits. Finding ways, in Tom's language before, to integrate them in appreciative, helpful, healthy ways, that's the key as a therapist, which means we can explore what's your relationship with your practice or not. You've walked away from the church. Is that helping you become more aware of God? Because a lot of people, it's like, well, it did it a while, but not really. I don't think about God a whole lot. Does that make sense what I'm saying? Real quick questions before I move on, because these are like kind of bit things. Yeah, go ahead.
One of the most dangerous things I hear people say was, well, I was raised to believe.
Yeah, I was raised to believe.
And then it goes, And the only reason sometimes that's nice because they are raised to believe that if they pray the 23rd Psalm or say it, they'll feel better. Nothing wrong with that. I would never take.
Well, and that's a raise to believe and a practice.
And a practice,
Yes.
right, okay. Here's where I get nervous. The idea that, even me, I'll just use myself as an example, that as my faith blends, morphs, blobs out, blobs in, whatever you want to call it, I get scared. People get scared of the idea that they can reform their beliefs. The people who are in charge of churches are afraid of reforming a church because they're going to lose the church.
Yep.
Young people are afraid of forming in at all to a church because they're going to lose myself.
Yep.
Can you speak a little bit to that dismantling of fear?
Yeah, well, there's a difference. If they're coming into therapy, that's a lot of the exploration. The problem is not a lot go to therapy who are dealing with those on a basic level.
Some of mine too.
Yeah, I think if you're working with pastors, they have a legitimate fear of changing because people bite. Remember what I said about the preservation mindset, the survival mindset? The more churches in survival mindset, where they intuitively know they're going to close in the next 10 or 15 years, they're the most willing to bite pastors. I think this is sort of a little bit moving out of your work, and this is the work that I do, where I do a lot of work on teaching them skills of how to transform, like for example, churches. If you're going to help people undergo transformation, you have to help them feel safe. A lot of times pastors come in and they just try to change everything, but they never make the people feel safe. And this is where a lot of, like us as therapists, we can teach them counseling skills, of how do you listen to people? How do you go slow enough that allows them to transform, that keeps moving them forward, but doesn't create massive anxiety. And so for a lot of the work I did when I was at Calvin Church was taking very cautious steps, but always putting pressure to move forward, but always checking in with people. How are you feeling about this? Checking with the staff, how are you feeling about this? What are you feeling? What are you seeing? If we needed to, we would slow down. And a lot of times, you'll get pastors and people who just barge ahead because they feel like they're prophets. But the problem with prophets are, they come in, they drop their truth bomb, and then they have to go running to the desert because everybody wants to kill them. I tell them to be more like apostles, which is you go in, you eat their food, you learn their language, you learn their customs, you know how to talk with the Jews, you know how to talk with the Gentiles. You then transform them from where they are, which is kind of what we do as therapists. I don't know if that's answering your question. It's more, the question of fear is how do you help people explore with people in a way that helps them feel safe. Does that even remotely answer that? Because it may be the best I can do.
So if the remedy for fear is safety, which that certainly resonates.
Yeah, transformation is, anytime we're doing from through to, formation, transformation, reformation, we have to help them feel safe in going through the transformation phase. That's where a lot of people, and when I work with pastors, most of them do not help their churches feel safe. They just don't. They come in and they go, we need to, real quick example, this isn't therapeutic, but when I was at Calvin Church, we were asked to come alongside a church up in Butler, Trinity Presbyterian Church, that had gotten what churches do, which is we're going to get a nice young pastor and his wife and kids, and they will help us attract new family members. It was a 200-member church in 2010. By the time he left 4 years later and renounced the denomination, it was a 17-member church. That's a particular talent right there. Not many people can do that. We were asked to come alongside them, and when we came along, about 13 members had come back after the guy left. But we spent, and it was a very conservative congregation, and I am not, that's not where my theology is. They're a very conservative congregation. We came alongside them for 2 years. And instead of coming in, we did say to them, we have to move you faster than you're ready for. And I kept saying that to them over and over again. We've only got 2 years. I've got to move you faster than we're ready for. I'm so sorry for having to do it. In other words, I kept meaning, you can trust me, but I know what you're going through. I know you're struggling. And every step of the way, we'd move forward, but we'd always check in. How are you feeling about this? Are you okay with this? Are you doing? And eventually, we were able to get them from about 30 members to about 42, and attendance from about 25 to 38. And they went along with the transformation. But a large part of it was we had to keep bending over backwards to make them feel safe to do it. I basically was using therapeutic skills to help them feel safe. I don't know, I'm just okay, well, I'm going to move on, if that's okay. So here's another way I want you to think about spiritual orientations. And this, to me, again, is really important. Right now, you have way too much information in your heads, so it's going to be hard to retain this. But you still get a CEU credit for it anyway, so just do your best. This is based on the work of a guy named Urban Holmes, who did a history of Christian spirituality. And I've changed the language a little bit, but he recognized there are 4 basic orientations, spiritual orientations, that people tend to have, and that also churches tend to have. Intellectual, which is very cognitive, theological, thinking oriented. That's Presbyterians, very much Presbyterians, United Church of Christ. And then there's emotional, which is very much focused on how I feel. That's very much the charismatic Christian movement, the Pentecostal movement. You would put Pentecostals here, you would put Presbyterians here. There's also a level which is embodied, which is I experience God through things. So what Susan was talking about with the act we did, here was somebody who actually had an embodied spirituality. He's on a retreat. He goes off to the amphitheater. He's sitting by himself. There's nature around him. He is open to the experience of God coming through things. And even with Susan's interaction with him, it was exploring God through things. God who's embodied in nature, in place, in your physical body, etc. There is also another aspect of spirituality, which is emptying. By the way, if you want to know what the technical terms for these, they're apophatic and cataphatic. You can see why I changed the terms. Emptying is, I'm trying to open up to the experience of God by emptying myself of everything. There are traditions that are both embodying and emptying. Can you think of a psychotherapeutic practice that is emptying? Meditation. And by the way, it's one of the reasons why if you have people who are fully ensconced in an embodied kind of spirituality, meditation is going to be really hard for them. Meanwhile, mindfulness is somewhere in between that, where you're becoming mindful of everything but detaching, but it's still embodied. You're open to the experience of God through everything. The thing that we need to be aware of is we have to get a sense of where people are. Are they coming at their spirituality from a more intellectual perspective? So if you get somebody coming in who has really strong belief systems, that's probably somebody who's more intellectual. If you have somebody who is more emotional, I feel God when I do this. I feel God when I do that. I didn't feel God in this. I'm not feeling God in this, putting me in a crisis. That this is someone who has a more emotional spirituality. Embodied spirituality can be, I experience God through nature. I experience God through reading the Bible. I experience God through worship. I experience God by sitting by a lake. I experience God at the seashore. I experience God by hiking mountains. What you're noticing is most people's spirituality is much more embodying than it is emptying. It's my way of saying, be careful as you use meditation that this is somebody who's open to it. Because it can become, and same thing with Christian contemplation, which is what Christians call meditation. For people who have grown up with a complete embodied experience, you need to train them slowly in the meditation and contemplation instead of saying, well, you just need to find a way to meditate for 5 minutes. For somebody who's used to a complete embodying spirituality, 5 minutes can feel like 4 minutes and 30 seconds too long. And it actually impacts the relationship we have with people. I mean, I was trained by one spiritual direction, we should always teach our people to do 4 to 5 minutes of quiet silence at the beginning of our times. Well, I did that with somebody, and I was perfectly comfortable doing it because I've done it a lot. And somewhere in the middle, I just heard her squeal, kind of go, I looked up, and I said, do you want to stop, don't you? She said, yes, please. And I realized this isn't a good way to go with somebody who's not used to doing it. Liturgical. So I'm going to kind of give you a sense of where all these are, but like if I was going to put churches here, denominations, I'd put Presbyterian, United Church of Christ up here. I would kind of put Methodists kind of here, Episcopalians here. Most of the Catholics are kind of all, kind of in this area. But interesting thing, what the Catholic Church does that's different from the Protestant churches. In the Protestant churches, when somebody has a different kind of spirituality that they're not being allowed to express, they create a new denomination. In the Catholic Church, they create an order or a society or a community around it. So, you're part of the Sisters of Divine Providence. There's what's called a particular charism at the center of it. Do you know what your charism is at the center?
Yes, Providence.
Okay, and so there's sort of a kind of an openness and
Providence.
yeah, it's an openness or whatever to God, and so prayerfulness, openness, silence, you'd be much more comfortable in, whereas others might not be as comfortable in them, if that makes sense. Others, you have the Trappists, which, if you know Thomas Merton, is much more silence, but you also have some that are much more active, that are much more engaging. So why does this matter? I think what matters is that we also can recognize problems that occur as we're doing counseling with people who get caught up in particular where they become too much to the extreme. For example, dogmatism. You will get people who are just really dogmatic and it's really hard to shake their beliefs. And if you try to challenge them here, they have a PhD wherever they are. So moving them into where are you, okay, but you're really caught up in this doctrine, you're really caught up in that. How does it make you feel? How does it, do you experience God through that? Well, how do you experience God through that? It's actually using this as a way of helping to develop them in areas where they're not strong, as opposed to where they are. But you have to find a way to be balanced in that. Biblicalism, that's where, it's like everything is what the Bible says, and it's not really what the Bible says, it's what my interpretation of the Bible is. But you can get caught up in arguing about that, or you can try to open them up to God a little bit more in areas of silence or quiet. Again, emotion. Works focused, where their focus is being really active. And again, that can be more balanced by quiet, by solitude, by times alone. Others are focused on salvation and damnation. Am I going to heaven? Am I going to hell? Again, it's so a way of thinking about this is people who are intellectual, have a spiritual approach that's intellectual and embodied, they experience God through intellectual activities. Reading, studying, etc. People who are more kind of a balance between emotional and intellectual, but more embodied, often they can get caught up in deeds. I'm not doing enough deeds to, basically save myself. A lot of times you can get people who are down here who become obsessed with the demonic or spiritual warfare. And again, you can get caught up in debating the demonic and spiritual warfare, but you can also open them up to a different thing. Well, let's put, you can chip away at the beliefs a little bit. You can ask questions of, well, if the demonic is that strong, does that make God weak? and I'm not doing this to debate this, but I'm kind of curious to explore what your thoughts are about it. How far do these beliefs go? Another is in the emptying, there can just be a lot of spiritual ambivalence, where, you know, I'm just open to everything, but I don't have structures of belief. Again, I realize I'm going over these things fast, but it just is. Also, you can find people who are obsessed about sin and repentance. They have, what it is here, it's I have these beliefs and I experience God through them. Here is I have all these bad thoughts and bad things, and I need to empty them from me for God to come to me. So for example, how many of you ever saw the Da Vinci Code? Do you remember the albino monk? Mm-hmm. He had a cincture around his leg, and as he had these thoughts of doubts, what did he do? He tightened it and he dug it in, because this is somebody who's kind of in this phase where it's all about, I have to purge myself of sinful thoughts. I have to purge myself of all the things that get in the way of God. Again, with those things, when you have people like this, you can open them up to here. Well, let's talk, instead of talking about what you have to do to empty yourself of God, how can you open yourself up? Where do you experience God in good ways? Where do you experience God's grace or God's providence? Because you're really making grace and providence dependent upon your repentance, your actions, your purging yourself. Where do you experience God outside those purgings? This is sort of a cognitive map that just kind of gives you an idea of, if they're this, how do I maybe move a little bit over here? Not completely to the other extreme, but maybe move them in the middle. I will simply say a really healthy spirituality is not one that's hypnotizing, but is one that is actually kind of, I would say, a really healthy spirituality in general is one that's able to integrate all of them. And so you can use this as a way of trying to get a sense of where are they. And to me, it's very similar to, you never ask a narcissist what he or she is thinking, because you'll get a dissertation. You always ask, well, how does that make you feel? Or what are you feeling when you do that? You never ask someone with histrionic personality disorder, how do you feel? Because you'll get a PhD dissertation. Instead, well, what are your thoughts about that? It's also with people who have borderline personality disorder. Dialectical behavioral therapy really is having people explore intellectually where they're really trapped emotionally. This is a similar idea of paying attention to where people are spiritually, so that you can pay attention to how can I move them maybe into a different place. Before I move on from this, any questions about that?
That's a good assessment tool.
What? Well, that's what I'm trying to do with all these things, is to give you simple assessment tools that you can be more intuitive with. You know, that you can think about this. Oh, this person really seems to have, really into theology. So maybe I need to move into the experience of God outside of theology. Or this person's really kind of like all over the place. Maybe I can explore, what are your beliefs? Are there ways of sharpening them up? Or you only experience God through things. Is there a way you can move into silence and quiet and slow down and calm down? And it's a way of just thinking about how to balance these things off. Any other thoughts or questions? Yeah, Tom.
Another application of this is how we come into the therapeutic
Where are we?
relationship. And I don't have a spiritual orientation only if my client has a spiritual orientation. I always have my spiritual orientation.
And be aware of where you are.
Yeah, and that, just as an example, the emptying, I always have that notion from Hebrews about kenosis, about the fact that Jesus didn't grasp divinity but emptied himself.
Yeah.
And so the way I pray before I start my day is, God, let me not get in the way.
Yeah.
Empty my obstacles. So bringing my spirituality to the room is not dependent on who I'm seeing.
It's being aware of that. I was actually thinking also, Well, I think I'll get to that in a second. Give me a second. Where this also, you can deal with this also in marital issues. I'm married to a Roman Catholic. I'm Presbyterian, so I guess my orientation would be somewhere up here. Diane is Roman Catholic, so she's very liturgical. You know, for me, if I'm going somewhere and there's just no thought, you know, I'm just getting a sermon that is kind of it kills my whole spiritual vibe, whereas for her, as Diane would say, I have to be careful, this is recorded. As Diane, I'm not sure she's ever listened to a full sermon in her whole life, because growing up Catholic, that's just not part of what you do. You don't really listen to the sermon, you're just there to be part of a liturgy. And that becomes the spirituality. And it's you know, there's kind of a balance there. And I'll say the alternative. So when I was pastor of a church, we had a worship service where we had communion every Sunday, which Presbyterians don't do. Because Presbyterians are scared that, like, if you do communion too often, like, something terrible is going to happen. Like, it's going to cheapen the sacrament for everybody. Whereas meanwhile, the Roman Catholics are like, well, if you don't have it, it's. My mother-in-law, when we were getting married, got really upset because we were going to do our wedding at 3:30. If we waited till 4:30, it could count as mass for the next day. But then we also said, well, we're not even going to have communion because I'm Presbyterian. She said, well, why can't you just have Father Bob do communion for all the Catholics and your pastor can just do communion for all the Presbyterians? I said, well, I can't really do it that way. And she's like, oh, fine, I'll have to go to church the next day or not go. And if you're Catholic, you laugh much harder at that. There are, I'll have you just kind of look at these, but there are spiritual practices that do correspond to these. And I don't know if you have these or not. But there are theological reflection, intellectual Bible study, journaling, liturgical worship, contemporary worship, praise and singing, tongues, prophecy, laughter, present moment mindfulness, contemplative prayer, in the embodied intellectual, confession, fasting, mortification. These are practices that if you want to engage people, you can have them think about these kinds, or you can build your own practices based on them. It's just being aware of where these practices are. Example, somebody who's here may really respond well, but actually, yeah, somebody who's here may really respond well to journaling. Somebody who's here may really not respond well, or here, or here. These aren't automatic, I mean, because, you know, people respond to different practices. That's just a way of kind of giving you a sense of where practices exist on this, especially particular religious practices. Okay, 10 minutes is the final push, but any questions or thoughts about that? Last thing I want to do is I want to help you understand how, because whoever you're working with comes from some theological practice tradition. Now, and you say, but what about people who don't go to church and haven't grown up? You still have a belief system, and you still have practices. They just may not be religious. But as therapists, despite the fact that we are seeing more and more of a spiritual but not religious crowd, we are still working with a lot of people who are coming from different religious traditions. And what I want to do, the final thing, is to help you understand how to pay attention, how to think about where they are in terms of their tradition so that you can adjust to using their strength, their resources, or if they're struggling with them, how to open them up to something else. There are basically 5 basic Christian spiritual approaches. Theology, or a theological approach, which we've already talked about, that's very intellectual, very much based on do you think the right way about God, about the church, about life, about everything. It's very head-oriented, but there are a lot of people whose basic spiritual approach is very theological. there's also biblical. People who have read, if I would say Presbyterians are very theological. Howard, you come from the American Baptist Church. In some ways, it's much more of a biblical tradition. The Southern Baptists also, it's much more, we theologically have a theology that's based on interpreting the Bible. Whereas I think in the Baptist approach, it tends to be much more biblical. The theology supports the biblical interpretation.
Yes.
Whereas I think in my tradition, the biblical interpretation supports the theology. Presbyterians would never agree with that, but that is what they do anyway. But there's basically a biblical approach where whereas I refer to the Bible for everything. That can go anywhere from I read the Bible constantly to I memorize the Bible to I'm not sure what I do, so I throw the Bible open and wherever my finger lands, that's God's guidance to me. That's still a basic biblical approach. Again, being aware of where your client's coming from, it may or may not help you figure out how to respond, but it does help on intuitive levels. There's also liturgical. I would say the Roman Catholic Church is very liturgical. The Episcopalian and Anglican churches are very liturgical. The Lutheran Church is very liturgical. Liturgy is just a fancy way of saying they're really focused on having a particular kind of worship service where there's a formality to it, where you say kind of printed prayers, responsive prayers. Sacrament is often part of it. There's often candles, vestments for what the priest wears or what the pastor wears. It can be, academic robes like what Presbyterians wear, but often it's a liturgical robe, which you'll see like white with what are called albs and cinctures, and there's a lot of formality. And again, this basic spiritual approach is much more practice-oriented. I give myself over to the liturgy. I take part in daily mass, or I take part in weekly mass. That's my spirituality. Something to be aware of is you may have someone who's struggling because they no longer believe. They come out of a theological orientation, but they may not completely believe in it anymore. So how do you help them to explore other ways of thinking without necessarily making them feel afraid? Someone who's biblical, they may find that they're struggling with what the Bible says, especially with what the Old Testament says. How do you help them to open up to different ways of thinking or even interacting in life? Can we put the Bible aside, or can we find passages that help us tell us where God is instead of focusing on God's judgment, and can we engage in practices that open us to where God is? Liturgical, there may be people who just go, I go to the service now, but I don't get anything. I find it feels very empty. Can we now explore other beliefs or thoughts, or get them engaged more intellectually somehow, or engaged biblically? I mean, this is, again, it's just ways of thinking about these things that you're balancing things off. Charismatic, that's a word that doesn't mean really good in a crowd. Charismatic often refers to Pentecostal, or the Catholic tradition has a charismatic tradition. It often involves things like prophecy, speaking in tongues, but also healing prayers. A lot of TV evangelists are from the charismatic tradition. They're not only charismatic themselves, but they're really big into prayer and things like that. If you get someone who's struggling with that, can you help them to explore other possibilities? Again, it's always about balancing people off. They're coming from something that's a little more extreme. Can I help them look for ways to balance? And the final thing is contemplative approaches. And these have to do with, mindfulness type stuff, prayerful stuff. A lot of the Protestant, the traditional Protestant contemplative tradition is the Quaker tradition. In the Catholic Church, they have 1 million orders that are devoted to the contemplative tradition. That is one of the ways the Catholic Church has dealt with the contemplative, is allowing people to move and create orders. And I will say, but the orders are different. I mean, definitely the Jesuits are what I would call the Catholic Protestants. They're very much theological and biblical. You have others more in the parishes are liturgical. You do have charismatics. For a long time, there was a charismatic Catholic church down in Ambridge. I don't know if it's still there, but they often did healing prayers and things like that. And then there's also contemplative movements, which is a lot of the different Trappist orders and things like that. Thoughts or questions about this?
Well, just a comment, going back to Tom reminding us that this is about integration. When I think about doing treatment with someone, I may pull from CBT, I may pull from psychodynamic, I may pull from EMDR and so on. And so as I'm thinking about working with someone who is following some sort of spiritual problem and so on, now this gives me a template to think about. Maybe I need to pull from here or pull from there.
Yeah, and that's ultimately, I don't, it's hard because I don't know exactly how to tell you always to do this. For me, it's stuff that I do now intuitively because I've understood this. It's cognitive, but it is, I really would encourage you to take these things, and just periodically look at it and just think about what it means when you take these slides, because ultimately you have to figure out what the approach is. I mean, I can't tell you what a standard approach is. I know that I do it a lot, but because I've been working with this population for such a long time, a lot of it is intuitive, and I don't necessarily know how to say, this is what you do. It's
Linda
more being aware of it.
Linda and I were talking about blowing up, one of these things, and just having it there to see it, to remind us of that.
Well, and periodically you'll have something and you go, oh, this person's coming from a real liturgical thing and they're feeling trapped by it. Then it becomes, I don't know really what to say, but I can now explore that with them. Mm-hmm. It seems to be like your liturgy isn't working anymore.
Right, and we may not intervene from it, but it's just something to have in our back of our
that they can explore, Okay, sticking with the basic things and rapid fire, I'm going to give you even more feed for your head. There are also basic religious approaches to be aware of. There are 3 basic ways people understand God or divinity. Transcendent, which is God or gods are beyond us in heaven and apart from the world. The Jewish faith and the Muslim faith tend to correspond to this perspective. Remember what I said about spires, steeples? Anybody know where the architecture for steeples came from? Where the idea came for steeples?
Islam?
It did. Came from Islam, gold star. The minaret is a structure that symbolizes actually jihad, this idea that we struggle to stretch up towards Allah, who is beyond us, and we need to stretch for God. And this is not complete. I mean, there's certainly Muslims who experience God, Allah, as being all around us. But being aware, the Jewish tradition and often the Muslim traditions, as practice-oriented as they are, they tend to be transcendent traditions where they see kind of God as apart from us and not here. So questions of where do you experience God can actually help with those populations because it may not be the way they approach things. For the Muslims and for a lot of the Jews, it's about reading scripture, clarifying my thoughts, acting in the right way so that we can make ourselves presentable to God. There is also incarnational traditions. God or gods are incarnated in a world or in people in nature. This is more Hinduism, Shintoism, Taoism, Native Americanism, where they believe gods are incarnate in and through everything. Again, you may not get these populations a whole lot, but if you're working with someone who's Hindu, be aware that they're coming from an incarnational tradition. Explore that with them. Explore the incarnation. You may not know where to go with it, because I'm not sure I know where to go with it with a Hindu, even though I've studied it. Doesn't necessarily mean I know what to do with it. I'm better with Jews, people who are Jewish and Muslim than I am with that. But I do recognize I can use their language. Well, tell me about the pantheon of gods that you really do have affinity for. How are they helpful? Where do you experience them? What is going on with that? Then there's also universal, which is God as an energy or a force in and through everything. And this is Buddhism. Buddhists typically don't talk about God, or if they do it to make you feel comfortable. Buddhists tend to talk more about the universe. If you saw Ted Lasso, anybody see Ted Lasso? Like 3 people.
I just started it.
Oh, okay. Sam Obisanya has a thing where he's trying to figure out what to do with his life. And he goes, oh, I think the universe is telling me to do this. That's very much coming from kind of a Buddhist thought, although in many cases that's where therapy has gone also. God is an energy in and through everything. Also, religions can be belief-oriented, where the focus is gods are beyond us in heaven and apart from the world. Actually, I don't know why, whatever I originally wrote for these things aren't there, so ignore that part. Belief orientation is, my whole focus is having the right beliefs. Praxis orientation is my focus, is doing the right things. Doing the right things can be engaging in mission. Doing the right things can be doing daily liturgy, mass, and things like that. I think that's final thing, except I'll just throw one last thought out and then we're done. So if you remember all the stuff I had on this side, transcendent, incarnational, and universal, when you're working with Christians, there is a way of also recognizing one of the things that makes Christianity different from other faiths is Christianity, the idea of the Trinity, which is there's one God through the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, is a recognition that we actually take those 3 different orientations and integrate them into our understanding of God. Father is often identified with it can be God who is up there. And if you have someone who primarily prays to the Father, you may have an understanding that that person sees God as being very much like their own fathers, or mothers, or authority figures. I mean, I worked with one guy who basically, his father was distant, but he went to a church where the pastor was domineering, and so he saw God as either being ineffective and distant, or when you do get God involved, domineering. And either case, he had a hard time kind of opening up to God. And so we looked at, which I mentioned this before, we looked at different ways of understanding God. Jesus is often identified as personal friend, or in the past and future. Jesus is the incarnation of God, not only in the person of Jesus 2,000 years ago, but according to John, at the beginning of creation, Christ is in and through everything, is in everything. Final thought. Holy Spirit is God who is energy, who is around, in, and through everything. This is the same way that if you have someone who is stuck on God being one way, understanding the Trinity as experience can move you into understanding God as other ways. So I'm going to stop there, but if anybody has, let me see if there's any questions, not only about this, but about anything Susan and I have talked about today. And I do realize, information is now leaking out of all your ears. Any thoughts or questions? Well, thank you all for being part of this. If you signed up for CEUs, as long as you signed in when you came in, you will be getting credit for the CEUs, right, Susan?
And as long as you hand me one
Yes.
of these gems as you walk out the door.
We do have evaluations that were required by Pitt School Social Work for you to fill out. You can get an evaluation from Susan.
No, they're in the packet.
Oh, they're in the packet.
Yeah.
Fill out your evaluations and give them to Susan. So I'm just going to say a prayer of blessing over all of you as we finish. Gracious God, thank you for today. Thank you for the opportunity, Lord, to explore how to bring you into therapy, even when we're not aware of it, and even when others aren't aware of it. And I pray, Lord, that your blessing would be upon every person here, because ultimately everybody here is a healer, seeking to heal others in a way that brings wholeness and holiness to life. And so be with each and every one of them. Amen.